The moon shall be as blood, the sun black as a thundercloud. The stars shall turn to blue, and done by darkness bowed, shall make sun dark, and give no day, when stars like skies shall be. When heaven and earth shall pass away, wilt thou remember me? That's how Remembering Babylon begins. The prologue is a poem by John Clare that David Malouf brings to the reader's attention. A very good evening to all our members, guests, participants who have joined us across puddles and ponds and who have been doing this for the past 15 months. I'm Dr. Julie Mehta, and it makes me enormously happy to welcome you all on behalf of the Bengal Club, its president, Mr. Ambarish Dasgupta, and the chair of our library subcommittee, Dr. Shundeep Chatterjee. Celebrated as one of the most powerful novels that explores the brutal reality of colonialism, post-colonialism, Remembering Babylon by David Malouf was written in 1993. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and won the Impact Dublin Literary Award. Considered an explosive piece of fiction that gestures towards the senseless killing of thousands of indigenous people of the world, particularly the United States, Canada, Africa, and Australia, of course, it also speaks loudly to the Indian South Asian history of colonization. Much neglected and underrepresented in world literature collections, our book under exploration today is a story that excavates the egregiousness and inhumanity perpetrated by white Australian settlers from England, specifically Scotland, in Remembering Babylon, on the indigenous population of an entire continent. Dazzling in its minimalism, intensely enigmatic, the ultra racism that is represented in the way the protagonist, a young outcast, is othered by his own white settler community, then adopted by the Aborigines, and finally hunted down by a gang of marauding white settlers, makes the history of colonization come alive after 75 years of our own independence to Indian readers. Remembering Babylon is an embarrassment of literary riches. It has emblazoned documenting of Australia. With an extraordinary grasp over language, after all, Mr. Malouf is a poet first, and a deep understanding of human nature, the keen realization of white domination and racial superiority by settlers in the 1850s who wiped out or almost wiped out an entire race, the Aborigines of Australia, author Malouf delivers a whammy of a story in a minimalist style and is considered one of Australia's finest writers. As a poet, the compelling story located in the body and the mind of Jemmy, who is neither white nor black, but rather white and black, unearths the inextricable dualities in human beings. What I think is important to note is the multiplicity that lies within the author, David Malouf. Born in 1934 in Brisbane, Queensland, where he grew up, to a Christian Lebanese father and an English-born mother with Spanish roots, David Malouf has lived in Tuscany, England, and now resides in Sydney. The fact that he is openly gay textures his lived experience and affords him the multiplicity of vision, as I was saying, and voice too, to understand acutely the issues of colonialism, marginalization, and belonging in Australian history, which intersects with our own history of colonialism in India to a great extent. The novel Remembering Babylon is set in the mid-19th century in the outback of Queensland, deals indirectly with differing and opposing cultures, that of the new settlers who are white and that of the Aborigines, the indigenous people of the land. This, of course, has already been done, some might argue, by Australian Nobel laureate Patrick White in his novels Voss and A Fringe of Leaves. As White had done in Fringe of Leaves, Malouf started out too with a historical reference to a work by F.T. Gregory. Malouf found an account of a certain Jemmy Morrill there. He later, employing his reading, and set about inventing the story of Jemmy Fairley, a 28-year-old outcast who suddenly alights on white civilization 600 miles north of Brisbane, one day in the 1814s. In Remembering the Past, we learn that Fairley started working for a brutal employer, a rat catcher in London, until he set fire to his master's house and ran away to sea. After 2 years at sea, Jemmy is cast overboard off the Australian coast and is taken in by Aborigines for 16 years until his visit to white civilization at the beginning of chapter 1. Malouf does not deal with Jemmy's life and Aboriginal culture, perhaps because his predecessor, the famous Patrick White, the Australian Nobel laureate, his senior, had already treated a similar subject. The subject was Ellen Roxburgh of Fringe in this light, who is another English sea victim forced to live with Australia's indigenous population until her return at the end of the novel. Our introduction to Jemmy is dramatic and is worth noting, replete with irony and unforgettable. After his first words, "Do not shoot, I'm a British object." Object. Note, not subject. Jemmy is taken in by a family of Scottish origin, the McIvers, where there are 3 children, Janet, Meg, and an adopted cousin, Lachlan Beatty. Jemmy is taken in by this family, the poor savage, half child, half sea calf, who smells of dead meat and has an odor about him. The novel recounts the turbulence and divisions brought to this savage white settlement by the confrontation with the other, in this case, a human who falls uneasily into their constricting and primitive categories. Malouf, celebrated as in its pages of identity, power, dominance, marginalization, the searing pain of isolation, colossal suffering, the colonial desire to dominate through recording and learning everything about the colonial subject's culture, so their very essence is laid bare and possessed by the colonizer. This is so evocatively represented in the way the Christian minister, Mr. Fraser, uses Jemmy, the outcast in between black and white fella, as a native informant, master of spatial, uses a subtle, understated style in his own characteristic, minimalist way to paint a persuasive picture of typical 19th century Australian outback existence. To conclude, I'm reading from our Bengal Club member, Mrs. Indrani Roy's response. She can't be here with us today since she's traveling in Germany, but she captures the essence of the story, rather like a dream catcher does a dream. And I quote, "I really liked reading this compelling and powerful novel written by David Malouf. I found it amazing yet horrifying, beautiful though heartbreaking. The poetry of his prose is outstanding, captures achingly moving scenes. He conveys the brutal power of the geography and the landscape. Delicately, though relentlessly, he focuses on racial intolerance and the question of identity. Jemmy is a truly lonely person. The gulf between him and most of the colonial settlers remains unbridgeable. To them, he will always remain a white black fella, someone to be treated with suspicion and distrust. How telling, how telling is that first sentence Jemmy utters. Don't shoot me. I'm a British object. The error of the word object is deliberate and shows David Malouf, the author's finesse and adroitness with language. And that is how Jemmy's circumstances have made him identify himself. We'll go through a few PowerPoint slides just to put us all in the mood and give us a little bit of contextual, historical, and literary background. And I'm particularly thankful today to Srijatha and to Mohini Pradhan, who is my research assistant, and she is my techie wizard. David Malouf, the Australian novelist of repute and still alive, which is really celebratory. He's 88 years old. Explores how the loss of language plagues the central character of his novel, Jemmy Fairley. The white child raised by Aboriginals in a colonized Australia was forcibly corralled into being civilized again by a white settler family and an entire white settler community. Next. So, a prolific writer, since 1975, his first novel was Jono. But he's not just a novelist. Malouf is a well-known playwright, he's a libretto writer, and first and foremost, he's a poet. Next, please. Now, I want to concentrate on this idea of language and words, which he speaks about in another novel, Ransom. Malouf says words are powerful. They too can be the agents of what is new, what is conceivable, and can be thought and let loose upon the world. Next, please. So, from remembering Babylon, we understand the importance of non-verbal communication, because when words fail Jemmy, he finds a way which he's learned from the Aboriginal people, from their culture, how to communicate and convey emotions, deep thoughts, non-verbally. This is what Malouf says about Jemmy. He lost his old language in the new one that came to his lips. His old language was English because he's a British boy. As for things, nothing he had dealt with had been his own. He was very, very poor. He came from the dredges of British society. He never owned anything. He worked for a rat catcher. As for things, nothing he had dealt with had been his own. He had stammered over most of them. Now they slipped away altogether. They dropped out of his life, and with them and the words went whatever thin threads had held them together and made up the fabric of his world. It was the words he had to get hold of. It was the words that would recognize him. The word flew into his head as fast and clear and whistle of its breath. Axe! Axe! Circles of meaning rippled away from the market blazed in the dark of his skull. No spoilers, but Jemmy is possibly killed. by white marauding settlers. So the word axe in the novel has a world of meaning. It denotes where Jemmy's future is headed under the ground. Next, Mohini. So the term translation, when he talks about language, is not to describe a transaction between texts and languages, but in the sense of how we learn, the etymological sense of being carried across from one place to another. The beautiful word in Sanskrit is bhashantar. So the crossing, and he uses translation metaphorically to describe the condition of the contemporary world, a world in which millions migrate and change their location every day. In such a world, translation of thought, of language, of emotion is crucial. Next, Mohini. So I will just leave you with this idea where Patrick White, David Malouf's Nobel laureate Australian writer and predecessor in Voss and in A Fringe of Leaves, echoes the ideas of racism and inhumanity as well as love that are the central themes of Remembering Babylon. Next, please, Mohi. So one of the quotes from Remembering Babylon goes thus: good reason that for stripping it as soon as you could manage, and they're talking about the land of the native, for ring barking and clearing and reducing it to what would make it at last just a bit like home. Herein lies the irony, the anomaly of the colonial desire to possess land and the equating of that need to possess, that greed, extending to possessing and dominating human beings. And as we see in settler communities, whether it's with the First Nations in the US and Canada, or whether it is with the Africans in Africa and in Australia, it is the same story of possession, domination, othering, and isolating and killing the indigenous people, so that colonial power, colonial greed, and colonial superiority can exist. It is a great pleasure now to open up the floor and have the responses from all our participants, members, scholars, attendees, and particularly thank Jean Carroll Ewart, the librarian at Florida University, for making time so early in the morning and coming in to be with us, and so many of you as well. First on the cards is Dr. Choitali Moitro, whom I invite to give her response, and she always does such a brilliant job of the overview of the novel. So go ahead, Choitali.
Hello everyone, good evening. Thank you Julie Di for giving us this wonderful read this time. This book, I felt, is the artist's struggle to establish his vision of selfhood and self-search. Through waves of cultural confusion, through soul force and elemental encounters. These give rise to the themes which we all sort of talk about: racism, isolation, exile, relationships, and so on. And this struggle that I'm trying to talk about, it comes and it gets established through a very, very powerful language. And the suffering of Jemmy makes him try to reach and identify a spiritual world. And I think that word spirit is very, very important in this novel. Just to sort of quote two phrases, quote unquote, the British object, quote unquote, the parody of a white man, quote unquote, the mixture of monstrous strangeness and unwelcome likeness, all point out to that idea of, again, quote unquote, tormented spirit. He remains a tormented spirit. So the language tries to question the cognitive faculties of both Jemmy and the new settlers. And finally, what I feel like saying, that through a multi-layered and omniscient narration, the beauty of the spiritual instinct is shown, driving home the fact that home, the word home, is a very continuous thing, and it's a mental condition as emulated by Gaston Bachelard. And that is where the book succeeds most, because everyone is actually trying to find home, and the jostle, the cross currents, the difficulties they face constitute the novel.
Thank you, Choitali. As always, a very comprehensive overview touched upon one of the most incisive and insightful aspects of this novel, which is loneliness and suffering and the idea of sainthood, the idea of isolation. And that comes through so well in your explication of Jemmy. Thank you very much for that, Choitali. And we move on to now our resident historian, Dr. Harish Mehta, who has dealt in his teaching and his research and his publications on issues of colonialism in Australia as well. So, Harish, 3 minutes, and look greatly forward to your overview and to your analysis of how land and possession, colonialism, and its terrors, its horrors come into focus in Remembering Babylon. Thank you.
About the First Nation. The novel is about the First Nations, or historically referred to as the Aboriginals of Australia. And so the broader issue and some of the historical things I just wanted to point out. I've been doing a lot of research for some years now on the Aboriginal condition in Australia. I published 1 or 2 book chapters, and one of them was a analysis of Patrick White's one of his novels, which again traces the journey into the Australian outback by a group of early British settlers. So basically, the indigenous Australians have occupied the continent of Australia for more than 65,000 years before the English colonial settlers came in 1788. The Aboriginals were hunters and food gatherers and survived on wild roots. So their men hunted or fished, and women collected vegetables, foods, insects, delicious insects, shellfish, honey, and other smaller creatures. They never had permanent settlements and moved wherever water and food was available. So they had no claim to land. It was all common commons. It was global commons for them. So it has been estimated by several scholars that in 1788 there were between 300,000 to 1 million indigenous inhabitants in Australia. And by the time we arrive in 1901, of that 1 million, only 100,000 of them remained, according to several scholars. Now, what happened was they lost their resources, to the intervention of the foreign colonial power. They lost their land, and then there was a disease where diseases were introduced amongst them, and these were European diseases, for which the populations had no vaccines. In those days, they had no immunological systems. Venereal disease was brought in, as was smallpox, the flu, measles, pneumonia, and TB. So the English settlers very quickly appropriated native lands and removed the indigenous people by cutting them off from their food sources and engaged in massive genocidal events. So between 1719 and 1810, there was a Aboriginal group around the Sydney area called the Eora. So they began a campaign of resistance against the English invaders in a series of attacks under one of their leaders, whose name was Pemulwuy. And now what these attacks were not frequent. They occurred once, and they were a rarity. So the white newcomers were determined that the whole of the continent should belong to them: the soil, the birds, the beasts, the river, the fish, the minerals, and the trees. So the lust for new lands ran rampant through the whole British race, that the monarch and the lowliest laborer alike glowed with the desire of creating a new empire. This I quote from one of the foremost scholars of Aboriginal studies. And so the more the settlers appropriate native land and destroy their means of survival, the more the indigenous people begin engaging in resistance. So the English colonizers and their descendants called the indigenous Australian Aborigines by giving them a new name that had no meaning for the people who had their own, local, ethnic, national group names. And so, the black fella was one of the names. And once they were objectified, it always becomes easier to terrorize and kill. So the massacres of the Aborigines was usually the work of groups of settlers or colonial police, and less often organized military force. So the killings were done with impunity in an ideologically driven atmosphere that mixed expansionism, racism, and colonial models with the fetish for cultivation and contempt for indigenous land use. So the Australian government used social Darwin ideology and eugenics to legitimize a series of racist policies and colonial terrorism on indigenous Australians to dispossess their rights to life and property. And they develop a classification of schemes which allegedly proved the inferiority of the native population on the territory that had been conquered. So the British settlers largely used the doctrine of terra nullius, which means that it was all vacant land when they got there. There was nobody occupying the continent. And they do this through violence. And according to terra nullius, Australia belongs to no one. And as the indigenous people did not have the concept of the law of ownership, they had no rights to the land. So the English settlers confiscate their land and other economic resources and destroy or obliterate indigenous institutions of self-governance and replace them with structures of colonial governments, and by repressing cultural and knowledge systems, by reducing quality of food, and depriving basic nutrients and causing physical debilitation and death. There were mass killings, intellectual, and of course there was resistance by the local leaders. And so to justify their crimes against humanity, the English settlers begin promoting the idea of a white Australia and the extinction of the indigenous Australians. The native land was declared desert and uninhabited, and later as terra nullius. The English settlers gradually decimated the indigenous population, obliterated their culture, survival, and identity. Colonial governors, in fact, granted land and ordered their troops to kill the indigenous, to kidnap their children, as well as kidnap them as unpaid labor. They ordered their troops to strike the blackfellow with terror or teach them by terror. On a public meeting, one colonial official declared, the best thing that could be done would be to shoot all the blacks and manure the ground with their carcasses. Cox or others recommended likewise that the women and children should especially be shot as the most certain method of getting rid of the race. Cox was one of the senior guys at the time. One English juror called indigenous Australians a set of monkeys, and the earlier they are exterminated from the face of the earth, the better. And meanwhile, the indigenous people were shot down like dogs while sleeping around their fires, their women taken from them to gratify the lusts of white men, hunted and persecuted in all directions, and in fact looked upon as savage beasts of the forest, whom it was necessary to get rid of, no matter how. For instance, in colonial Victoria, in 1834, blacks were estimated between 5,000 to 10,000. But by 1886, just 40 odd years later, only 800 survived. And so then diseases like smallpox, measles, and TB killed several thousands of the indigenous. The settlers used food poisoning to kill the blacks. They distributed poisoned flour to commit premeditated murder. This has been documented by Broome and by Jean Coquimbas. And biological warfare was used in colonies in New South Wales, particularly at Port Jackson in 1789. And so because the British had at their disposal various matters in bottles. However, written accounts of the period describe with wonder and sometimes with horror the numbers of corpses strewn around the harbour, but none of them mention the use of the vial of the virus in the bottle, even for the purposes of inoculating the newly born white children. That is, I think, all I have. And thank you so much.
Everything that has to go wrong is going wrong today on our technical side. My computer's just gone off the blink. So let's just address a couple of the issues which Harish brought up. And I think it's a great contextualization of the history of which Jemmy Farley is a living example, well represented by Mr. Malouf, and the issue of his death at the end of the novel ties in with the need for white domination and extermination of the blacks as a necessary process to make it white Australia. Okay, moving on. Let's see what we have with Anju Munshi. Anju, will you step up, please?
Thank you, Julie Dee. I'm right here. Good evening, everybody. The first 20 pages had me down with a lot of boredom and disappointment. But as I progressed with the book, I think there was an impact. And by the time I reached the end, I was completely overwhelmed. You know, it's a beautiful book, a beautiful read. And the writer, David Malouf, he goes back to the time of colonization to recreate an interesting, a very captivating, and a very powerful issue that reflects, things like identity, cultural disparity, and also colonialism. I very strongly felt that there was a very strong symbolism, which runs throughout the book. In crossing the boundary, Jemmy actually is, it's an effort to, cross the man-made boundaries, with his, but then what happens is he acquires a double identity. So the symbolism says that he needs to, demolish these man-made boundaries, but there is something which happens. His identity is threatened. And that becomes a kind of, a very, a very sensitive thing comes in the book, which, has most of us worry and, think about Jemmy. His identity crisis, his displacement, when he dares to cross the boundaries and separate the boundaries that separate the civilized from the uncivilized. And also he becomes a kind of an alien in his own community. He's neither a native nor a white. There is no sense of belongingness. There is oppression and there is victimization, and which leads to a displaced soul. There is a kind of disorientation also which sets in, which Chaitali spoke about. And I'll just read it out to you. There is a very interesting line which I came across. The furrow in his brow, was it a white man's thought that set in there? Quote unquote. The second one, quote unquote, despite being cleaned up by Mrs. McCord, the smell of half meat, half mud never left. So the Aboriginal smell is distinct and so different from the rest of them. So that makes it into a very touchy narrative, and also very often quoted by many readers is like in order to save himself, when he says, "Do not shoot, I'm the object," not a subject, he's an object, a piece of something. There is an isolation of a culturally defunct being. Then again, Chaitali quoted a line, quote unquote. I'm going to be doing that also because it's a very powerful line and refers to the settler colonialism, which is at monstrous strangeness and unwelcome lightness. There is a repression of the indigenous people and culture, their identity and their soul. Jemmy also becomes very close to Lachlan, but the latter is dominant, and he derives a lot of pleasure in bullying Jemmy, hinting at the nature of a typical white exploiter who enjoys exercising control on others. Jemmy was a very instinctive boy. With the passage of time, he hardly remembers the English language, the cultural nuances, because of the sensibility acquired by and from the natives. But he was a very instinctive boy. Without communicating, he could understand what is being said and what is being communicated. The book ends on a very grim note. Despite efforts made for a cultural, unification and harmony, neither the natives nor the settlers accept his identity, and it comes to a dismal bad end. I did not do anything for good 15 minutes after I finished the book. I was numb. So probably that was the impact that the book had on me. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Anju. Just want to take up, you've said so many things which are of essence to Malouf's explication between the lines, but I can only take up one particularly troubling issue, and that is the creation of horror against the black-white identity of Jemmy, and this whole notion of using the senses, which Malouf does so well, and the relatability of the smell of half-cooked meat and the body odor, it keeps coming back again and again. And it reminds us of Julia Kristeva, the French feminist writer's ideas about the powers of horror.
And what that does is, by essentially making Jemmy Farley the obnoxiously uncivilized, subhuman person, it is easy to create disgust, distaste, and almost treat him as the other. So the point you've made, Anju, is so well connected to the idea of the abject. Only when we use the description of the horribleness of another person can you hate them, because only when you other them from what you are, then it is easier to hate them. So I think that's an excellent point that you brought out. Thank you so much. Thank you. Anusuya, are you ready to go?
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Good evening. I have heard so much, and there are so many layers to this story and the narration. I mean, what can you say and what can you leave? It comes to that. But I just, I mean, in an assortment of observations, I'll just offer my writing. I mean, my understanding of the story. I found a lot of similarity in the way he describes the attitude of the British settlers. And no matter which century it is, they come to a new continent because they want to better their lives. Yet they come with such preconceived notions of being kind of crusaders and bringing civilization to an uncivilized land. When that land is, like Harish mentioned, the Aborigines are 65,000 years present in that land, and they are obviously evolved, they're spiritually evolved, they communicate without words, their nonverbal communication knows no boundaries. It goes to show how far they have reached in that realm. And yet it is so not obvious to the British settlers with all their education, and they are so blind to it. So, it is just a small minority of the people mentioned in the story who had a kind of openness to them and had some acceptance of the of Jemmy. And this Reverend Fraser, with all his limitations, at least respected Jemmy's knowledge of the botany in the space and took the pains to learn from him and increase his knowledge base and draw and make things kind of record the flora of the space. And it's in doing so that, he kind of awoke to the fact that they were quite mistaken in the notion that they knew nothing. The British immigrants to these continents obviously didn't have the intelligence to recognize and learn from the native inhabitants how to live in that land. And another issue what Anju brought out was about how Lachlan was bullying Jemmy in their childhood when they met, because he had that prejudice ingrained in his DNA, perhaps in the unconscious way in which, I mean, I'll just quote, here again we see the unknown adopted land being referred to as absolute dark. And absolute dark or dark continent is how you see Africa. So the similarity is there in the way the British see all these lands. And as we progress in the story, we see how, Janet had a recognition of she was perhaps one of the few people who recognized the person in Lachlan and was really impacted by it. And one occasion which stands out is when she was attacked by the bees, and she felt a moment of enlightenment, and she, seeing through Lachlan's eyes, sees her old self as a burnt stump. And I thought that was very touching, the way he was recognized for his, at least by someone in his life, for his elevated consciousness. And again, she herself, her sensitivity is again visible in the way she notices in the end of the book, where she's sitting with Lachlan and she's looking at the weathered skin on his arms and that in hers. And she realizes that she was conscious of the sunspots on his hands, the scabs, like her own, like her father's, the wrong skin for this country. And for once, there's this one person who recognizes that it's they who were wrong, and it's the Aborigines who were actually right for the land. And I was on exploring and researching, I came across this video, a TEDx video by a Jonathan Sri, who mentions, I mean, this is of very recent inclusion in YouTube, about difference, the white approach is that difference equals wrong. So if you're dark-skinned and not sufficiently susceptible to the sun, then you are wrong. And that mindset is still alive. So yeah, that is what this book brought home to me, that separateness is still so alive amongst us. And with all these years of evolution and learning from history, we still haven't been able to really be there where we can be more inclusive. Can't hear you, Julie.
Sorry, Anusuya, spot on as usual. And what I think I want to pick up on this, and if anybody else would like to comment on it, is the fact that in post-colonial literary circles or readership, academia, whatever you call it, this idea of who is really the uncivilized one, and this idea of the white man's burden, which is very Kipling-esque, and you see that more than anywhere else in his poetry, as well as in his novel Kim, one would imagine, as you put it, whether it's the indigenous First Nations people, the Ojibwe, the Cherokee in North America, whether it is the tribes in Africa, whether it's Australia, the settler community comes with this idea, as do the colonial masters who were with us for many years. Luckily, they were not settlers. It is this idea that we are coming to civilize the world. But in fact, as has been argued, it is hardly that which is the reason. It is really economics that drives the project. The mining, the idea of gaining, corralling whatever indigenous knowledge, the idea of the native informant, using Jemmy for Fraser's documentary purposes, are all very colonial enterprises. And you brought out this issue very powerfully, Anusuya, about the white man's burden and how they have always propagated the idea that, oh, you know, we are here because we are here to make you better human beings, to educate you. So thank you for that. That was really one of the front and center focuses of this novel, I think. And you've done credit to that. Sangeeta, would you like to give us your views on the novel? Would be great to hear you. Are you here?
Good evening, everybody. So I'll just be there for a little bit, and I'll talk about the relationship between Janet and Jemmy. That's what I'll focus on. Now, as soon as Janet saw Jemmy, she felt that I see the light in him. I catch his spirit. She straight away was drawn, despite being a Scottish MacIver, she was drawn to this man because she felt there was something special that he had. And although he was an in-between creature, and everybody condemned him as a strange black fella, and she straight away felt that connection. She was, they had a very special relationship. And of course, the McIvers embraced Jemmy in their lives, despite condemnation from all their neighbors. And one thing, Jemmy said he was being re-inducted into human civilization, which actually is a misappropriation, because he was actually crossing over from the Aboriginal space to the white space. And he also said that he felt a kind of sadness, like hunger, but it was hunger of the heart and not the belly. So he was actually abandoning what he had been for 16 years and entering a new space. So again, there was a confusion of identity. And it was not necessarily that he was entering a better space. Now, this whole story is about, the exploitation and the destruction of the local environment of the Aborigines. And, it is sort of comes to a climax in page 118, when Fraser writes, "We have been wrong to see this continent as hostile and infelicitous. So that only by the fiercest stoicism, a supreme resolution and force of will, and by felling, clearing, sowing with the seeds we have brought with us," saying that, we are assuming that we're doing the right thing, but actually we are not. So in fact, Jemmy had embraced himself as a local person, which is what the future should be. Okay, he was an extreme case. He gave up being being literate or losing his language. Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Julie.
No, I was saying that, could you be a little bit louder, Sangeeta?
Oh, am I soft?
No, you're not soft, but a little louder would be
okay,
if
just
it's
Just
possible.
increasing my volume. Is it better now?
Better, much better, much better.
Okay, I just increased the
Thank
volume.
you.
So basically what Jemmy became in an extreme form is, when people move into a continent, that is what they should be actually, because he embraced the indigenous culture. He became one of them and he blended with the environment. He was not a destructive intruder. So actually he becomes the protagonist of the story, and this is what Janet straight away, that's where she connected with him. And also, Janet becoming an apiarist, the way she surrenders to the bees, even more than her teacher did, means that, she has surrendered to nature. So which is why she becomes such a good apiarist. And then when she sees the inability of themselves to hold on to Jemmy and Jemmy's death, she becomes a nun, because it's like, it's very sad, because she realizes the hopelessness of the indigenous population against the brutality of the colonizers. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it. So basically, yeah, that's it. That is, the special bond that she had with Jemmy, and she says in the end, we loved him. We loved Jemmy. So she says it at the beginning and she says it in the end. We loved him.
Sangeeta, I have a wicked observation to make. I think that was a wonderful connect that you did between the McIvers and Jemmy. Janet McIvers becoming an apiarist and then becoming a nun. Yeah, I somehow feel that Malouf is probably, in his own very understated way, trying to say that there was a lot of love there.
Yeah, there was something Oh,
Very special.
Whether fulfilled or unfulfilled, we don't know.
Yeah.
But so she took that path when Jemmy was no longer.
Maybe she couldn't really, there's no mention of it, of course, but she couldn't really think of loving anybody else, because inside of her, there was such a total commitment. And as you say, through nature, I think she found a connect with Jemmy. And at the end, when Lachlan mentions to her, at her prodding, constant prodding, what happened to Jemmy? What happened to Jemmy? I think that's when the dam sort of bursts, but with a lot of control on her part, because she's a nun. She's to keep that face, right? But it saddens us, as even I think Anju mentioned, that for a few minutes after you finish the novel and you see how Jemmy's been killed, it's something that Harish was mentioning, I think, a few days ago to us, that it was literally like killing a herd of cattle, shooting them down, driving them to the sea so that they had no recourse. And Janet knows this. Janet knows that.
And the poor guy was a man who was crossing over between two races and being good with both.
Yes.
He
never rebels, right, Sangeeta? He never really
rebels.
follows. I mean, the idea that Choitali put forward right in the beginning, the word she used was spirit. And spirit has in it that feeling of angelic distinction of a very evolved soul, right? And it reminded me that at the end of the novel, you sort of shut the book and you think, okay, so he didn't even stand his ground. He didn't hit back. It was as if he was living out the Christian virtues of mercy, pity, hope, love, turning the other cheek. So in some ways, I think this is also a spiritual novel,
Yeah, there was also one thing he said in page 180, and he said, this would only end when they were ended.
Yes.
That is, so he knew his end. He said, this would only end when they were ended.
It's so good to see, everyone's responses connect so beautifully. Thank you, Sangeeta. That was wonderful. Vivek, I'm just wondering, are you going to speak? We always look forward to your response.
Julie, no, I'm not going to speak because I really haven't read the book. I've been totally occupied, but I'm listening with so much interest that I will be reading it, I can assure you.
Thank you so much for being here all the way from Singapore. Thank you. Dr. Paramita Mukherjee Malik. Okay, so then that leaves us with a whole bunch of scholars and readers. May I start with Dr. Jean Carroll Ewart, very kindly joining us in the early hours from the University of Florida. Jean Carroll, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you everyone for letting me be part of this very genial group. I think this is my third time here.
Yeah.
And I'm now starting to recognize names and faces, and it's just lovely to be back again. I'm a narratologist by training. And so when I was reading the novel, I was automatically in my head kind of sorting it into a generic category. And at the beginning, when the perspective was mostly from the white family, I thought, well, this is a settler's narrative. And my family are all from the American Midwest. We read these all the time. My great-grandparents homesteaded in South Dakota and Minnesota. And it's about I'm using this word carefully, the dis-ease of being in an unfamiliar land and of trying to make a way in a new world. My ancestors came from Holland. They were dairy farmers. They found themselves in the Midwest. It's dry ground farming. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to ask anyone to do it. And they just had to kind of muddle through. And our narratives are filled with these settler stories. about how unforgiving and cruel the prairie sod was. So I thought we were there. And then when the perspective starts to shift, and so you see it from Jemmy's point of view more and more strongly, I thought, oh, so there's a North American tradition, and I don't like this term, this is not accurate, but it's usually called the captivity narrative. And it's about a white person who's taken into an indigenous group on the North American continent. They were often not captives. They were often escaping from white culture. And sometimes, like Jemmy, they were castaways and found themselves in the only place they could be. And they adapt to that setting, and then they find themselves back again. Sometimes they were kidnapped victors whose families came and got them back. And sometimes they stumbled out of the forest in the way that Jemmy does, expecting to find a place. And I thought, well, this is going to be that then. And those narratives are filled with, again, a kind of dis-ease, this one of the binary opposition being broken down. He's not us, he's not them. He's white, and yet he smells funny. You know, how do we can't accommodate him. And at the midpoint of the novel, when their inability to accommodate him becomes stronger and stronger, I was filled with a sense of dread. I thought he was going to be lynched on the page in front of me. I really did. I kept thinking, this cannot end well. And then I was surprised when the novel took a turn and the lynching takes place off stage and is only described to us indirectly and is so filled with ambiguity that we're not even sure that Jemmy was in that group. And yet we know he was, or if not that group, a group like them. There was only one inevitable end to this. And I thought, this is not, I had been trying to put it in North American categories. I thought this is a uniquely Australian category now, because the killings were done by vigilante groups of settlers, because it happened off stage, because the children were shielded from the horror of what happened, because history then effaced it. And then I thought, no, this is not a uniquely Australian narrative, because this narrative happened in every colonized space around the world. Where now in North America, we suddenly can't talk about slavery. We suddenly can't talk about the extermination of the indigenous people because it'll make white children feel bad. That's how you know when you've successfully exterminated someone, when you can't even say the words anymore. And in my home state of Florida, there's a bill in front of the legislature right now that says you cannot teach any aspect of history that makes any child in the room feel uncomfortable. And we know which aspects of history those are going to be. And so we will have successfully effaced even the things we did to indigenous people, and there will be no record of that left. And as I read the book, I thought, that's why we can't know how Jemmy died. That's why his end has to be so indeterminate. We, of course, know he did die because we're 100 years later, but that's all we can know. Thank you.
Jean, that was moving, and that was very innovative, the way you looked at the ambiguity. And I think some of us might know that Malouf has written librettos. He's a playwright as well. So this offstage killing of Jemmy, I think, is strategic, and perhaps the reasons you were giving, that it's layering, politically layering the killing of indigenous people by not bringing it to the fore. Maybe the horror is mitigated.
That's a really good analogy, because of course in classical Greek tragedy, the killing always had to be off stage. You cannot see it happen. Excellent point. Very good point. Thank you so much, Jean. You always bring a novel quotient to the reading. Thank you so much. Thank you. Vinod, we are waiting to hear what you have to say. Mr. Vinod.
Good evening, Dr. Julie, and hello, and good evening to all of you. This I found to be a very different kind of book, and a difficult book I had to go through it twice to make sense of it. And so I'll just talk about the things that struck me. I think this whole thing, the very first quote that is there in the book, as in the epigraph, whether this is Jerusalem or Babylon, we know not. I think that sort of, would lead me to believe that the book is all about, what is Babylon and what is Jerusalem. We don't even know it. So I mean, historically, people were exiled to Babylon and they suffered there. It was supposed to be a very bad place. And Jerusalem was supposed to be the holy place, which was pure, pristine. So the problem here is the book makes us wonder whether what we thought to be Babylon is really Babylon and whether Jerusalem is really Jerusalem. We see that happening here with Jemmy particularly, even with the other settlers when they start remembering Scotland and, remembering the days there and how they are having to struggle here in this new land with strange people, strange flora and fauna. So they keep remembering Scotland. Now they've actually left Scotland and they've come here. This was supposed to be the promised land. So you get this feeling that they're still not sure what is what. And on the other hand, when you look at Jemmy, you find him having gone among the Aboriginals, lived there for some time, and then he comes here to the settlers, white settlers. And that ought to have been, his Jerusalem. He was probably returning. But it isn't. It doesn't turn out to be that. It probably is, a worse Babylon. So I think that was the first thing that struck me about this book. Yes, there's a lot about identity. It's very beautifully brought out, especially in the case of Jemmy, I thought, because if you see the character, as long as he was in England, you find him, the very last act of rebellion and, burning that place and running away from there. It shows a person who is assertive, knows what needs to be done. Plays along for some time, but finally decides, okay, I'll cut it here and, do what is best for myself. You see that happening there, and then you shift to Jemmy here on the fence, and later on, you find him to be a very different kind of person. You don't find that Jemmy there. So probably, in my understanding, it's the time that he spent with the Aboriginals that seems to have changed him, their kind of attitude to life. Because finally, if you contrast the white settlers and the Aboriginals, the white settlers are constantly trying to, establish their dominion over the territory. They're just going on trying to add new places on the map and say that we are in control of this. Whereas the Aboriginals, they thought everything as, nature to be, lived in harmony with. So perhaps I can't think of any other reason why this boy should have transformed like this. So then it would come to the question of whether, when we talk of identity and all, after all, he's a white man. How does he become like that then? So if there is no distinct identity that a white person has, then it would mean that all this thing about identity is something that is, picked up, inculcated into us. And it's pretty superficial. There's nothing deep about it. Whether we talk about the Indian identity or the American identity, I think it's all a question of where you're brought up then. That's what we would think. So this is something that came to my mind. And also the importance of how language plays a role. I mean, it's just not the color of my skin. It's also the language. That's what made it problematic, because otherwise it wouldn't be so difficult. If he was, if we could make out that he's white, but he could speak English, then it would have been a different thing altogether. But what happens is he's lost the language. So language becomes extremely important. So if I don't know the language, then I would, then my identity is under threat. And then xenophobia follows, racism. It flows from all this. The other thing that I noticed in this is, yes, as many people have said, it's all about, it's a post-colonial literature which talks about the horrors of colonialism and, debunks the myth that colonialism was also good for us and it was benevolent and did so much for us. That gets destroyed. I won't go into that. Finally, what fascinated me most was the inner world of Jemmy, because the way he comes through to be a very different kind of character, because of the way he was in England and the way he starts behaving here. And the other thing to remember is that he could not even belong to the Aboriginals, because when he was there with them also, they had problem relating to him. And so they also made his life somewhat difficult. And I'm just quoting from this book, page 27, 28. No woman, for example, would have to do with him. And there were many objects in the camp that he was forbidden to touch. So he began his life among them, doing what he had always done. It was all he knew. Since he had somehow found his way into the world, his object, like any other creatures, was to stay in it, and by any means he could. He had a belly to be fed. He was accepted by the tribe, but guardedly. So the Aboriginals also did not accept him. But he managed to stay there. And then he comes to the settlers, and we know what a horrible experience it was. So you have this person who's in between, merely because the skin is not very clearly white, or more importantly, the language is missing, and the customs and traditions, you can't see it. He's not wearing it. So it really, makes you think as to what this whole thing is about, identity and how we understand ourselves and how the world looks at us. It seems as though the intrinsic worth of a person quite often gets overlooked. And finally, it's all about my skin color, my language, my customs, my etiquette. That is all that counts. And that's how the world, we deal with each other. Because we don't have the capacity to understand. I think that was what I felt with this book. Thank you.
Vinod, thank you. Very refreshing take. Loved the way that you fleshed out and went straight to the bone, if I might use that pun, to show that this anomaly of neither white nor black made him a sort of curiosity to both the cultures. So he was neither fully accepted by the Aboriginal elders or community, nor was he accepted at all, not even tolerated by the white settlers. Now, a question I'd like to throw at you, Vinod, and one has been teaching this text for a while, and that it keeps coming back all the time. Right through the novel, there is a harping of losing a word, losing the language. Even in his other novels, in Ransom, for instance, we know that, in semiotics, if you lose your language, if you lose your word, as you pointed out, then the acceptance level goes down because you're not understood. So within the first 20 pages, when Lachlan comes back with him and Jemmy is asked questions, he can't answer them because he cannot find that word. So I think in post-colonial literature, this is a big concern. How does the indigene, what is epistemic violence about? The violence of your own tongue. And here, how clever is David Malouf, Vinod, that he's turned the tables around. He's a white boy. He's an English boy, but he's lost his own language. So, there's much here that can be excavated. And I thank you for bringing this to the fore. Thank you very much. So there's a master scholar here, Ayushi Ayushi, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Would love to hear your response to remembering
Yes, ma'am.
Babylon. Yeah, she's one of our star scholars who's done very well in her masters. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. Today, I would like to focus on the aspect of Jemmy's identity, drawing a parallel with the land of Australia. So David Malouf states that while writing Remembering Babylon, the most difficult part was getting what I wanted without being pretentious or pretending to know something about it. Malouf, through the character of Jemmy, presents the indigenous culture of the Aboriginals. Jemmy, who is the white-black child, stands as a hybrid figure who comes flapping towards them out of a world out there. The novel starts by three children playing on the outskirts of the settlement when they notice something extraordinary. First, they think it must be a black man. In fact, according to Lackland, it is a thing that was not even a human. When Jemmy crosses the fence, he embodies from that point onwards the biggest fear of the white settlers, that is the black people raiding their settlement, or what we may call in Bhaba's term, the return of the oppressed. According to Nazan Yildiz, Jemmy's presence tastes the boundaries of identity categories. Jemmy's identity therefore exists in what may be called as a Derridian aporia. Before arriving here, Jemmy was an orphan from the slums of London who then went on to work with Willett, where he was kept as a servant. And since he was the only person Jemmy knew at that point, he assumed Willett's identity. From there, he went on to live with the Aboriginals for 16 long years. Jemmy was like water. He had no identity, no shape of his own, but went on to identify himself likewise the people he was living with at that point of time. Just like the land of Australia, where the present dwellers found it quite difficult to adjust to this strange land and was yet to develop a strong community bonding among them. In the novel, the character Mr. Fraser writes in his diary that the present settlers brought with them seeds, animals, even birds to make the island habitable, to shape it like the land they had left behind. What they failed to understand is that the land was already habitable. So Mr. Fraser says that the time will come when we too will be sustained not only by wheat and lamb and bottled cucumbers, but what the land itself has to produce. The structure of the novel is therefore partly based on something Judith Wright called the double aspect. On one hand, Australia represents the newness and freedom, and on the other hand, it's like a place of exile. Jemmy's appearance as the white man reminds the settlers that people like Jemmy exist in the underbelly of the English society that they're so proud of, that underprivileged people like him are written off the dream of power. Thus, Jemmy ultimately continues to live as no longer a white man or a European, but a true child of the place. Thank you.
Ayushi, I think you brought out some really very perceptive points about the connection between land and the connection that undergirds it to the idea of human identity. And possessing land and possessing human beings, there's an intersectionality. So would you then say, Ayushi, if I can just push us to think about this, or anybody else, Dr. Chaitali Moitro, Jean Carroll, anybody who's here, would you like to think about this novel as perhaps a very understated political question that Malouf is posing about how colonial masters wanted to map the territory, to find everything they could about the native flora and fauna. Basically, they wanted to possess knowledge. And in the idea of the Derridian archive, this is the Western colonial project of always having that knowledge, which belongs to the indigene. And when you have that knowledge, then it's easier to rule. So power equated in the Derridian sense to knowledge. Choitali, would you have any comments? Anybody? Please go ahead.
Ma'am, I think that what you said is absolutely right, because in the beginning of the novel, when the location of the place is being given to us, we are being told that that from this point to this point, the other part is not, because the other part is the where that the black people reside. So for the white settlers, it is not part of. It is, they don't want to consider it even as the part of the island. It's just from this point to that point that they live, that it's being considered. So, ma'am, I think absolutely this novel can be seen as kind of political statement that the colonizers have, like trying to map out, trying to chart out, this part of the land is mine. Yes, ma'am.
So you see how Malouf is actually, in his understatement, in his way in which he stylistically is minimalist, really delivers a whammy of a story, and makes us think about so many different issues to do with identity, to do with domination, to do with the colonial way of how they managed to dispossess. And they couldn't do it in India, for instance, because I think it was never a place where we had a civilization which went back to thousands of years. And because we had the script, we had the language, and we had little principalities of Rajas and Nawabs who were not about to just give up. And they would put up a resistance as well. So at Jahangir's court, for instance, we know in the 1600s, early 1600 in 2 and 3, East India Company sent a gentleman, an ambassador by the name of Michael Rowe, R-O-W-E. And it was proven that they had to come in as traders, as businessmen, because otherwise they would not be allowed in. I mean, India was not, what we know as India, the subcontinent, was not ready for the taking. So I guess in some ways that is different from the Australian story.
So it's a great pleasure to call upon Raka Mukherjee, who is done with her master's and is going to tell us about the colonial desire to map the idea that Harish was talking about earlier, cartography and the writing down, the recording and the documentation of the indigenous culture, even botanical fauna and flora. So it's a great pleasure to tie up the loose ends on this aspect of the native informant, which Jemmy becomes in the hands of Mr. Fraser, and the documentation of indigenous culture, which becomes a sort of archival power that the colonists had over the indigenous people. Go ahead, Raka.
A very good evening to everyone in the panel today, and I thank Julie ma'am for giving me the opportunity to speak today. In a very brief manner, I want to touch upon certain quotes from the book Remembering Babylon that really made me think, and mostly about the documentation of the colonial project. And I'm going to start with a quote from chapter 14. I think the speaker is Mr. Fraser, and he says that, "I think of our early settlers starving on these shores, in the midst of plenty they did not recognize, in a blessed nature of flesh, fowl, fruit, that was all around them, and which they could not, with their English eyes, perceive, since the very habit and faculty that makes apprehensible to us what is known and expected dulls our sensitivity to other forms, even the most obvious." So as we speak about the quote, this is actually Mr. Fraser documenting, writing this in his report of the Australian Botany and Agriculture. And the idea that the cultivation of the land, rather than not cultivating the land to produce English crops, the settlers are trying to make use of what already is growing in the land. And his report is kind of an interlude within the narrative. And it might perhaps represent Malouf's own concept of an alternative form of colonial settlement. How? It's because, while the colonial is a foreign group of people, they're establishing themselves in the homeland of the indigenous population. So, the proposition of of using the crops that are growing naturally in the land rather than growing English crops, it's like the settlers would embrace the land and the people who live on it. And they will also learn something from the Aboriginal Australians' knowledge rather than destroying what they have, destroying their home and enslaving them and dominating the land with their own crops, with their own knowledge of farming and with their own fauna per se. The futility of this is established in the chapter 18, where Mr. Fraser travels to Brisbane and talks to the governor of Queensland, known as Sir George. And, when he is suggesting that this alternate idea of growing Australian crops and how the alternative colonial settlement could be done, he is completely, I would say his opinion is dismantled by Sir George. And he is, I think there's a quote where Mr. Fraser writes about Sir George, where he says that he exudes an air of magnificent unreality that includes everything he looks upon. So considering that the report Sir George does see in it some possibility of grandeur several centuries in the future, which reviving his interest and gives him visions of vast orchards and gardens. But in his mind, the dreaming of this, of accomplishing it, it's basically futile, because he says that to descend to detail would be to miss the wood for the scubby little trees. He invites Mr. Fraser to have dinner with himself, his wife, and the Premier Mr. Herbert to further discuss the matter. But Fraser suspects that this is not really his victory. And finally, the report is never truly discussed, even in the dinner table. And that's why, ultimately, Mr. Fraser's quest and his vision to form a new or a better, less violent form of colonialism is, dismantled, and ultimately, theoretically, this concept is not given importance, and the reality, the fact that the colonization of Australia was achieved in a similar manner like the colonization of other British colonial projects, where the land seizure, violence, domination, and the civilizing mission of destroying a land and documenting it with an English approach, basically destroying what exists and creating a new English settlement, continues. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, and congratulations to everyone. Thank you.
It's been a great discussion. It's still open if anyone wants to jump in. Choitali, are you still here?
Yes, Julie. It's a very, very lively discussion. And I just feel like saying that, I don't know, please correct me if I'm wrong. Like, you see, thinkers, writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi Thongo, particularly Conrad, crossed my mind when I had been reading Malouf. And this whole idea of the double, for instance, in Secret Sharer, I'm sure Ayushi will be understanding, and many others. So yes, the border is that way, it is important. And when you say that they wanted to possess knowledge, look at America. What did they do? Think of Crucible. You see, I don't think we have been able to rise above this. I think Sangeeta pointed this out. This separateness is still very much there. And it's numbing. After reading the novel, as Anju said, she was numb. Most of us would be numb. You see, it's that's the feeling. Yes.
Absolutely. So I think the points that Dr. Jean Ewart, Carol Ewart also brought to the fore, Choitali, that now the technique is, oh, don't bring this up, the killing of the First Nations people, because it'll make First Nations people or African Americans uncomfortable in classrooms. But what you're virtually doing, as Dr. Ewart pointed out, is you are effacing, you are erasing what was history. So we have no more access to it. Dr. Ewart, are you here? Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Julie. I have learned so much from this discussion. There are so many aspects of the novel that, and this was my first time reading it, I had never seen it before, and there were so many aspects of it that I had not been able to think through until you raised the points that you did. I know very little about Australia, and I found it very instructive to read the novel. And one of the things I was interested in, this is such a small point that I don't know if I would have made it a major part of what I was saying, but there are two references in the novel to what Indigenous Australians call the dream time, which is the access they have to many generations that have gone before them. When you are born, you wake up, and when you die, you go back into the dream time. But you can, under the influence of trance, re-enter the dream time. And I think what happens when newcomers arrive, even if they mean well, which they very rarely do, but even if they did, they have no access to the long history of the land that came before them. So the white Australians didn't know what the dream time was until the 60s, when it was incumbent upon researchers to go and actually just talk to the Aboriginal peoples and say, what are these concepts? What do you believe that is different than what we believe? And of course, having nearly exterminated them, there were very few. I'm not sure how I feel about the word native informant, because it makes it sound like somehow it's incumbent upon somebody to inform, it's their business, ours. But we just get the hint from Malouf of what we did not know, everything that we did not know, and we didn't bother to ask or inquire because, like what happens with the school teacher and the minister, we're only interested in what we can extract. The extractive economy of the novel. Teach me about your plants, teach me about how to best conquer you, is what we bring to colonialism. And what we don't bring is teach me what I don't know, because it is worth knowing.
Yes, I think you've made, you've textured the point that I find fascinating about colonialism, which is, this connection of the archive. Knowledge is power, and nowhere better do you see that than going back to your phrase, native informant. Bernard Cohn, the great historian and theorist, writes about how the British Raj actually flourished because we were compradors. We were people who were ready to share the knowledge. And when I say we, I mean the class in castes that we know as Brahmins, because Brahmins had access to knowledge via Sanskrit. So there's a whole world out there, the colonialism and the enterprise of knowledge. And thanks for shedding that light on it, all of you. So thank you, everyone. And we'll keep you informed about the next book for March. We'll give you enough time to read, so no worries. Lovely to see you back again, Jean Carroll. Lovely. Lovely to see everybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
Great
Bye.
exploration. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.